The morning mist still clung to the hedgerows when the crew of Sherman M4A3 Clementine rumbled down the muddy lane toward the front. The air was wet and cold, the kind that bit through the wool of their jackets and made the metal surfaces slick to the touch. They were supposed to stop back at the depot for inspection before rolling out, but time had turned against them. Orders came fast and messy, the kind shouted through static radio and handed over by exhausted runners. "You're moving out in 10, the sergeant had barked. "Skip the checks. Enemy armor's been spotted." So they did. No one wanted to be the reason another unit got hit without tank support. The engine roared to life with a cough and a groan, and they went forward without the usual routine. No inspection of the fuel lines, no recheck of the turret rotation, no test of the gun elevation controls. Just trust. Trust in the machine, trust in luck, trust in each other. Inside, the smell was a choking mix of oil, sweat, and gun grease. The gunner, Peterson, muttered about the last time a tank skipped inspection. He'd seen one go up in a ball of fire when a leaky fuel line met a tracer round. But their commander, Lieutenant Harris, had that look of grim necessity carved into his face. He wasn't reckless, just practical. "We don't have time to be perfect," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the mist ahead. "We just have to be alive." The road narrowed into a choke point, thick with churned mud and broken fences. On both sides, the trees stood like sentinels, their bare limbs reaching out over the column of armor snaking through. Clementine was second in line, following the lead tank, Betty Lou. The sound of the tracks slapping mud echoed through the fields like a steady metallic heartbeat. From a distance, it was the rhythm of an army on the move, but up close, it was just noise. Loud, grinding, merciless. They'd been told this sector was quiet, that the Germans had pulled back to regroup, but anyone who'd fought here long enough knew better. Quiet never meant safe. Quiet meant the ambush hadn't started yet. Inside the Sherman, the intercom crackled with nervous chatter. The driver, a kid from Ohio named Morris, asked if anyone else smelled gasoline. The loader laughed it off, saying everything in the tank smelled like gas and death anyway, but Harris frowned. He did smell something faint, sharp, chemical, out of place. He thought about stopping, checking the lines, doing the inspection they'd skipped, but the thought lasted only a second. Stopping meant breaking formation. It meant being alone. Out here, alone, meant dead. When they reached the edge of the village, the mist thinned and revealed the ruin ahead. Smoke curled up from shattered houses, and somewhere distant, a single shot cracked through the cold. "Eyes open," Harris ordered, voice low. The gunners adjusted their optics. The loader reached for a shell, the kind marked "He" in faded white. The tank felt alive beneath them, the engines rumble a kind of pulse syncing with their own. Then the world shattered. The lead tank, Betty Lou, took a hit from the left, a direct shot that tore through its side armor and ignited the fuel. Fire roared out like a dragon's breath, and for a moment, the road became hell. Shrapnel clanged off Clementine's hull as the crew ducked instinctively. "Ambush! Left flank!" Harris shouted. Morris threw the tank into reverse, mud spraying as the treads bit deep. Peterson swung the turret toward the flash of muzzle fire and answered with a thunderous 75mm round that shook the ground. The shell struck the building hiding the German gun, and it collapsed in a cloud of dust and brick. But the fear stayed. It crawled up their throats and sat heavy in their chests. Another shot rang out, grazing Clementine's rear plate, but it didn't explode. They didn't know it then, but the skipped inspection, the very act that should have doomed them, had saved their lives. The misaligned safety valve on their external fuel tank had never been corrected. If it had been, the hit on their rear would have sent the whole Sherman up in flames. Instead, the faulty valve had vented pressure in the wrong direction, preventing the explosion that should have killed them all. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. When it ended, the silence was worse than the noise. They could hear only the hissing of steam, the crackle of burning wreckage, and the distant echo of retreating engines. Harris climbed halfway out of the hatch and stared at what was left of Betty Lou. No movement inside, just blackened steel and smoke. "Lucky," Peterson whispered. Harris didn't answer. He knew luck had nothing to do with it. Sometimes, fate plays its cruel games in ways no inspection, no checklist, no training could ever predict. Sometimes survival comes from imperfection, from the flaws that make things human. Clementine stood there, engine idling, crew shaken but breathing, alive in a war that devoured the perfect and spared the broken. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from? The day after the ambush, the battlefield smelled of metal, earth, and the faint sweetness of decay. The The survivors of the armored columns sat in silence beside their tanks, faces streaked with soot and fatigue, the air heavy with the unspoken. Clementine had made it through with only scratches and a bent rear plate, but that didn't make anyone feel like victors. The mechanics came down from the rear lines later that morning, grumbling about the missed inspection and the idiots who thought they could roll without protocol. Harris didn't argue. He knew they were right. Technically, procedures existed for a reason. But as one of the mechanics crouched by the fuel assembly, tapping a wrench against the valve housing, his expression changed. He motioned Harris closer, squinting through the grime. "You see this?" he said. The officer leaned in. The safety valve was jammed half open, misaligned so slightly that no one would have noticed during routine maintenance. "If this had been fixed," the mechanic muttered, "you'd be ash. That hit on the rear should have cooked the fuel instantly. Hell, this tank's alive by accident." Harris stared at the small imperfection, an uneven thread, a twisted bolt, and felt something shift deep inside him. In a world obsessed with control, precision, and the illusion of order, they had survived because of a mistake. It was almost funny, almost holy in its absurdity. The kind of thing soldiers don't tell anyone, because no one believes it when they do. The men didn't laugh about it. They couldn't. The cost was too visible. Betty Lou's wreck still smouldering down the road, her crew buried hastily under a blanket of earth and ash. Peterson lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the tip glowing orange in the grey morning. "Guess the army's gonna write that one up as luck," he said, his voice low, flat. Harris nodded absently, watching the smoke curl away into the cold. He knew what the report would say. Enemy ambush repelled, 2 tanks lost, 1 damaged, mission successful. Success! It was a strange word, too light for the weight it carried. He thought of the men inside Betty Lou, of how their last moments must have felt. The roar, the blinding heat, the sudden nothing. He thought of how Clementine, just a few meters behind, had lived because a single piece of metal hadn't been right. War was full of such small, cruel miracle. In the mess tent that evening, surrounded by the smell of burnt coffee and tin rations, the crew sat together, not talking much. The laughter that usually filled those hours was gone. When Harris finally spoke, his voice was almost lost in the murmur of rain hitting the canvas. "We're not here because we were better," he said. "We're here because something broke the right way." That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time Harris closed his eyes, he saw fire. The image of the explosion replayed in his mind, the way it consumed the tank in an instant, the way the shockwave rippled through the earth. He thought of the inspection list pinned to the command board back at the depot, the one they'd ignored. Line after line of checks, fuel line, turret rotation, ammo rack stabilization, valve alignment. One skipped step, one missing signature, and here they were, alive. It was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew about order and chaos. Maybe the war wasn't about skill or even courage. Maybe it was about endurance, about who could keep walking through the madness long enough to see another dawn. When he finally drifted off, it was to the sound of the rain tapping the tank's hull like quiet fingers, each drop a reminder that the world outside was still there, still indifferent. The next morning, they were ordered forward again. No rest, no pause, just the endless rhythm of engines and orders. The column moved out before sunrise, cutting through the fog toward another nameless village on the map. Morris, the driver, glanced up at the sky and whispered, "Let's hope Clementine's bad luck holds." No one corrected him. They didn't call it luck anymore. They called it mercy. As they advanced, Harris found himself studying the tank differently. Every dent, every patch of rust, every imperfection now looked like a story written in metal. The Sherman wasn't just a machine. It was a survivor, shaped by battle and brokenness in equal measure. The men inside it were no different. Each carried invisible cracks, memories of things they couldn't unsee, names they no longer spoke aloud. Yet those fractures held them together, like the welded seams along Clementine's hull, imperfect but unyielding. In that realization, Harris felt a strange calm settle over him. The war would go on. Men would die. Machines would burn. But somewhere in the chaos, there was still meaning to be found, not in perfection, but in endurance, in the small, flawed things that somehow refused to break completely. If you've ever felt that strange twist of fate, the one that saves you when everything should have gone wrong, then you know what Harris and his men carried with them that day. They didn't march with pride. They rolled forward with gratitude and dread in equal measure. The inspection they skipped became more than a story. It became a reminder that even the smallest choices can echo louder than explosions. If you're still here with me in this story, Take a moment to subscribe, because the next part of this journey will take you deeper into the war than these men ever thought they'd go. 2 days later, the calm broke like glass. The column rolled east through a narrow valley that locals called the Cauldron, a name that should have warned them. The terrain funneled every sound, magnifying each rattle and clank until it felt as though the earth itself was grinding its teeth. Harris sat half out of the turret, goggles streaked with mud, scanning the ridgeline. The sun had returned but offered no warmth, only glare, blinding and merciless. They'd been told the valley was secure, that friendly infantry had cleared it at dawn, but Harris had learned to distrust every report that began with secure. He'd seen too many secure places filled with death. Peterson, the gunner, wiped his brow and asked if they were still heading towards Saint-Aubin. "If the map's right," Harris said, "and if the map's wrong, we'll find out soon enough." That got a dry laugh from the loader, O'Donnell, but it died quickly. No one really wanted to speak. Words wasted breath, and breath was a precious thing inside a Sherman tank where air came thick and hot and smelled of oil and tension. They reached the midpoint of the valley just before noon. The road dipped between two low ridges dotted with trees. Harris felt it first, a cold pressure in his gut, that soldier's instinct that doesn't rely on sight or sound. He tapped the side of the turret. "Hold," he said. The convoy halted. Silence, then only the ticking of engines cooling in the air. He lifted his binocular. The ridge on the left looked wrong. No birds, no movement, just stillness. Then came the flash, so brief it might have been sunlight, but the thunder that followed erased all doubt. The first shell struck the lead tank and turned it into a storm of fire and steel. The explosion slammed through the valley, and before the echo faded, a second round hit the rearmost vehicle. The column was boxed in. "Ambush! High left!" Harris roared, ducking inside as fragments whined off Clementine's hull. The driver threw them into reverse, but the road was too narrow. Smoke rolled in from burning wrecks, and the valley filled with the deafening roar of German guns. "AP round! Left ridge!" Harris shouted. Peterson swung the turret, the motor whining, and fired. The shells soared up and tore through a patch of brush, silencing one of the enemy's guns in a flash of dirt and fire. Another shell hit near their treads, rocking the tank like a ship in a storm. Inside, everything was chaos. Orders, curses, the clang of metal. O'Donnell scrambled to load another round, his hands slick with sweat. The radio crackled with broken voices, the kind of half-words that told Harris other tanks were already gone. "We're the only ones still firing," Peterson shouted. Harris didn't answer. He was already lining up the next target. Another flash from the ridge. He fired again. The 75mm bark, the recoil slamming through the hull. Dust and smoke swallowed the valley. Through the haze, Harris glimpsed shapes moving. Infantry, German, descending fast. "Machine gun!" he yelled. Morris gunned the engine, pivoting the Sherman sideways as Peterson raked the slope with Coke's fire, brass casings raining like golden hail. Men fell, vanished, kept coming. The noise was absolute, the kind that erased thought and replaced it with instinct. For minutes, or maybe it was hours, there was nothing but the rhythm of firing, reloading, and the constant fear that the next shell would find them. Then it happened again. A hit to the rear. Sharp, brutal. The tank lurched forward, alarms whining. O'Donnell shouted that the rear plate was cracked but not breached. Harris's heart pounded in his throat. That was where Betty Lou had been hit. He imagined the same fire, the same roar, but it didn't come. Smoke filled the compartment, but no flame followed. The misaligned valve had done its strange work again, venting pressure through the side. They were alive, somehow. "Still breathing," Morris gasped. Harris didn't even have time to feel relief. Another blast shook the ground. "We can't stay here," he shouted. "We'll die if we do." He ordered the driver to push forward through the wreck of the lead tank, through the fire if necessary. The idea was madness, but staying meant death. Morris revved the engine to its limit, the treads screaming as Clementine rammed the burning wreck. The world vanished in orange light and black smoke. Heat washed over them. For a second, they couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Then they burst through the other side, the tank coated in soot and flame residue, but still moving. Behind them, the valley burned. They regrouped on the far ridge, just 3 tanks out of the original 7. The others were gone, either destroyed or trapped under the collapsing slope. Harris climbed out coughing and looked back down the valley. It was a graveyard now, the air heavy with the acrid stench of cordite and burning rubber. For a moment, no one spoke. Peterson sat on the turret, face pale, staring at the smoke. "We were supposed to inspect this tank," he said quietly, as if speaking to no one. "We were supposed to fix what was broken." Harris nodded. "Maybe what's broken doesn't always need fixing," he said. The words hung there, heavy, unsure whether they were wisdom or madness. Around them, the landscape was silent again, but the silence felt different now, not calm, but hollow, echoing with what had just been lost. They stayed there until sunset, waiting for orders that never came. The radio was dead, lines cut, the network gone silent. Harris knew they'd have to find their own way back. That night, they camped beside the smouldering wrecks, using the heat from twisted steel to ward off the cold. The men barely spoke. The fear had turned into exhaustion, the kind that settles into the bones. O'Donnell polished a shell absent-mindedly, his hands trembling. Peterson cleaned the gun sight with mechanical precision. Morris just stared into the dark, whispering something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. Harris sat apart, watching Clementine's hull glow faintly in the firelight. He thought of all the things they'd survived, of how the tank seemed to refuse death no matter what the world threw at it. Somewhere deep inside, a part of him began to believe that the machine had a soul, or that somehow the souls of those they'd lost had settled inside it, keeping it alive. When morning came, they would roll again, because that was what soldiers did. Not because they wanted to, but because the war didn't end when they wanted it to. It ended when it decided to, and until then, all they could do was keep moving, keep firing, keep surviving. And in that valley where fire met steel, Clementine had proven again that imperfection could be the thin line between life and nothing. By the time Clementine reached the outskirts of Saint-Aubin, the world had turned grey. The sun was buried behind smoke, and the sky looked bruised, as if even heaven had grown tired of watching men die. The crew had been running on black coffee and willpower for 40 hours, their eyes red from exhaustion and fumes. The war had a way of stretching time, until every minute felt like an hour, and every hour like a lifetime. The streets were empty, save for the wind that whispered through shattered windows. Once, this had been a town, families, markets, laughter, but now it was just bones and silence. The tanks rolled in cautiously, guns scanning for movement. The infantry that was supposed to meet them had never arrived. Somewhere in the confusion of the valley ambush, the radio orders had gone wrong. They were alone again. Harris leaned out of the turret, hand shading his eyes, scanning the rooftops. "Looks clear," Peterson muttered. "That's what they always say," O'Donnell replied, his voice brittle. They all knew what came after "looks clear." The sudden flash, the shot from nowhere, the sound that made the heart stop. Harris nodded. "Stay sharp," he said, and the tank crept forward, its tracks grinding over broken stone and twisted metal. The first shot came from a church tower. It wasn't a tank round, too sharp, too quick, a Panzerfaust. It streaked through the air and struck the cobblestone in front of Clementine, throwing dust and shrapnel across the glacis plate. "There!" Harris barked. Peterson swung the gun, fired, and the tower erupted in flame, sending debris cascading through the street. But the explosion was only the beginning. Germans were still in the town, infantry, hidden among the ruins, armed with anti-tank weapons and rifles. "We're surrounded!" O'Donnell shouted. The sound of small arms fire filled the air, echoing through the hollow streets. Bullets pinged against Clementine's armor, harmless but constant, like angry rain. Harris directed the driver to pivot into a side alley, using the buildings as cover. They returned fire, the coaxial machine guns spitting fury, tearing through walls and shadows. The smell of gunpowder filled the interior. Peterson's face was streaked with sweat and grime. "They're close," he said. "Too close." Then came the real threat, the rumble of an engine that didn't belong to them. "Tiger!" Harris shouted before he even saw it. The unmistakable growl of German armor rolled through the smoke. It appeared at the far end of the street like a nightmare, its long barrel swinging toward them. Clementine was outgunned, outclassed, and out of options. "Reverse! Reverse!" Harris yelled, but Morris hesitated for half a second, just long enough for the Tiger's gun to fire. The round struck the building to their right, blowing it apart. Bricks rained down, and dust filled the air. "We can't take it head-on!" Peterson shouted. Harris knew that already. The Sherman's 75mm could barely scratch a Tiger's armor from the front. They needed movement, speed, a miracle. "Flank it," Harris ordered. "Smoke out." O'Donnell launched 2 smoke grenades, filling the street with thick white clouds. Morris threw the tank into motion, engine roaring as they cut through the alley, circling behind the church. The Tiger fired again, blind, missing by inches. The impact shook the ground. As the smoke swirled, Clementine emerged behind the German tank. Peterson aimed for the rear, where the armor was thinner. "Now!" Harris shouted. The shell roared downrange and struck true, punching through the Tiger's engine. The explosion was instant, violent, final. The German tank lurched forward, its turret spinning off-kilter as flames burst from the rear. For a moment, the crew inside Clementine sat frozen, the echo of the shot ringing in their ears. "Hit confirmed," Peterson said, voice trembling. No one cheered. Victory didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like another breath stolen from death. The silence that followed was heavier than the battle itself. The town was theirs, or what was left of it, but the cost was everywhere. Bodies in doorways, smoke rising from the church tower, the smell of burned metal in the air. Harris climbed out and looked around at the ruins, the faces of his men barely visible through the grime. "We made it," O'Donnell whispered. Harris nodded, but his eyes were distant. They had made it, yes, but for how long? Every time they survived, the gap between life and death grew thinner, like the thread of that misaligned valve that had saved them twice. That night, they set up near the town square, the tank still warm from the fight. The air was cold, the sky full of ash. Harris sat on the hull, staring at the burned-out shell of the Tiger. He thought of the men inside it. Enemy soldiers, yes, but men all the same. Maybe they'd had a lucky machine once too. Maybe they'd skipped an inspection once and lived because of it. Maybe the war didn't belong to heroes or villains, but to the broken, the ones who kept stumbling forward through the fire. Peterson joined him, lighting a cigarette, his hands shaking. "You ever think this tank's cursed?" he asked. Harris didn't answer. He looked at the scratches, the bullet mark, the patchwork repairs. Clementine was too stubborn to die. Cursed or blessed, it was hard to tell the difference. In the dark, the sound of distant artillery rumbled like thunder. Tomorrow, they'd move again. There was always another village, another fight, another chance for fate to decide. Harris closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the vibration of the idling engine beneath him. It was strange comfort, steady, alive, imperfect. The same imperfection that had saved them now felt like a heartbeat of its own. He whispered quietly, "Don't quit on me now," as if speaking to an old friend. Maybe he was. Maybe Clementine was more alive than any of them dared admit. The war had taken everything that was clean and made it dirty, everything that was solid and made it fragile. Yet in that fragility, in that near breaking point, there was something human, something worth holding on to. When dawn came, they'd start the engine again and roll forward into whatever waited beyond the horizon, because that's what men like them did. Not heroes, not machines, just survivors clinging to what was left. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like something broken in your life ended up saving you? Leave it in the comments below and tell me. Sometimes what's broken keeps me alive. Copy and paste that if it hits you. And if you felt this story, if it pulled you in even for a moment, subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. The war isn't done with them yet. The next morning broke cold and pale, the kind of light that felt more like absence than dawn. The mist over Saint-Auban hadn't lifted. It only thickened, wrapping the ruins in a silence that felt almost sacred. Clementine stood in the middle of what used to be the town square, her armor streaked with soot, her paint blistered from heat. Around her, the world was still. No voices, no gunfire, just the distant hiss of cooling metal. The war had moved on again, but they were still there, like ghosts who hadn't realized the battle was over. Harris climbed out of the turret and stood on the hull, stretching his stiff back. The air smelled of smoke and wet stone. The church tower they'd destroyed yesterday leaned at an angle, its bell twisted in the rubble. A dog wandered through the street, ribs showing, tail down. It stopped near a burned-out jeep, sniffed, then disappeared into the fog. There was something unbearably human about that dog's quiet persistence, as if even the animals had learned to carry on without expecting kindness. Peterson emerged next, eyes sunken, uniform dark with oil. He didn't speak. None of them did, not at first. There was no energy left for talk. War had stripped language down to grunts, nods, the occasional curse muttered under breath. O'Donnell was cleaning the cannon's breech with a piece of cloth that used to be white. Morris sat on a crate beside the tank, staring at the road that led east. Every now and then, he'd look at his hands like he didn't recognize. Harris watched them, one by one, and thought about what the war had done, not just to bodies, but to faces. They were all changing, slowly, invisibly. Youth burned away by smoke and terror, leaving behind something hollow, but harder than steel. It wasn't courage, not really. It was survival, a quieter, more desperate kind of strength that no medal could capture. The townspeople started to emerge later, cautious shadows at first, faces pale and tight, mostly women, children, and the old. They came out of cellars and shattered doorways, eyes wide at the sight of the tanks. Harris tried to speak to them, but the words came awkwardly, broken through language and guilt. One woman, maybe 30, held a child on her hip. She pointed to the church, then to the sky, and said something in French that Harris couldn't understand, but her tone was enough. It wasn't thanks. It was grief, maybe anger. The line between the two had long disappeared. Harris wanted to tell her they hadn't meant to destroy her home, that they had only been trying to live long enough to see another sunrise. But explanations meant nothing to someone staring at ashes. He nodded once, helpless, and she turned away. The child looked back, eyes wide, unblinking. In that stare, Harris felt something heavy shift inside him. It wasn't guilt alone. It was the slow realization that surviving in this war didn't make you the lucky one. It just meant you got to keep remembering. When night came, the men huddled inside the tank. The interior had become a kind of refuge, a cramped world of metal and ghosts. Peterson passed around a can of beans, barely warm, and they ate in silence. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine. "You ever think about home?" O'Donnell asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Every damn day," Morris said, still staring at nothing. "But I don't remember what it smells like anymore." No one answered that. Harris thought of his mother's porch, the way the boards creaked under his boots, the smell of cut grass after rain. He wondered if any of it still existed, or if home was just another thing the war had burned away. Sometimes he dreamed of going back and finding it all gone, streets empty, doors open, everything hollow. Other times he dreamed that nothing had changed, and that was worse, because it meant the world had gone on without him. The war taught him that both nightmares could be true. Later, when the others had fallen asleep, Harris stayed awake, staring at the faint light leaking through the vision slit. He thought about Clementine, the tank that shouldn't have survived, the machine that kept them alive through every mistake, every ambush. He ran a hand over the cold steel beside him. It felt almost like skin, like something breathing. Maybe it was madness, but he believed the tank had a kind of spirit, one forged from everything it had endured. The dings and cracks weren't flaws anymore. They were proof of life. Maybe that was true for people too. Maybe broken was the only way to stay alive in a world that kept trying to kill you. He smiled faintly at the thought, a sad smile, but real. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of artillery in the distance. The front was moving again, always forward, always hungry. Harris closed his eyes and whispered a quiet promise to the machine that had become his world. "We'll keep going," he said, "you and me, until one of us gives out." The words drifted into the hum of the night. No prayer, no hope, just a pact between man and metal, imperfect, enduring, alive. The next orders would come soon. They always did, but for now, in the stillness before dawn, there was a strange peace, a fragile one, resting on the edge of exhaustion and faith. And somewhere in that silence, between the crack of dying fires and the pulse of cooling steel, was the truth that Harris couldn't yet say aloud. Sometimes the things we think need fixing are the very things holding us together. If this story reached you, if it made you feel that fragile mix of fear and survival, then take a second now to subscribe, because the war's not over yet, and you don't want to miss what comes when the noise returns. By the 5th week, after Saint-Aubin, the men no longer measured time in days. They counted it by distance, by the number of burned-out vehicles they passed, by the number of faces they buried without names. The front had moved north toward the forests of Belgium, and Clementine went with it, always moving, always trembling under the weight of new orders. The tank was still running, somehow, though every mile added another rattle, another leak, another groan from the engine that sounded more like a dying. Peterson joked that Clementine had become part of them, a 5th crew member with her own heartbeat and moods. Nobody laughed. In truth, they all felt it. The tank had survived too much, carried them through too many fires to be just steel. It was as if the souls of those who hadn't made it, Betty Lou's crew, the men from the valley, had been welded into her armor. Sometimes, when the engine idled, Harris swore he could feel a pulse under his hands, faint but alive. The landscape changed, but the war didn't. Every town looked like the last. Ruins, craters, smoke, children with eyes too old for their faces. The men had learned to stop asking for news. The radio was just static now, the kind that filled the silence and reminded them that the world was still burning somewhere beyond the hills. They moved by instinct. Follow the smoke, follow the gunfire, follow the orders scratched into the side of ration boxes when the maps ran out. Each night, they slept inside the tank, their bodies curled around ammunition and steel. The air inside was thick and sour, but outside was worse. Outside was where the wind carried the smell of the dead. One evening, after a long silence, O'Donnell finally spoke. "You ever think about what happens when this thing stops?" he asked, patting the tank's side. "When the engine just gives up." Peterson shrugged. "We'll just sit here and rust with her." Morris nodded without looking up. "Better than burning." Harris didn't respond. He was staring through the periscope at the horizon, watching the faint flicker of artillery miles away. The war felt endless now, like an ocean they were trying to cross in a sinking ship. Sometimes he thought they'd already died and just hadn't realized it yet, that maybe this was what death really was, an endless march forward, trapped inside the echo of explosions that never stopped. The next morning, they reached a village whose name no one could pronounce. It wasn't on their maps. The houses were half standing, the roads broken by shell holes. They were ordered to hold position until infantry arrived, but no one came. Hours passed. The silence was unbearable. Harris got out, stretching, and walked a few yards from the tank. The air was still, but the ground beneath him felt wrong, soft, shifting. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. Underneath lay scraps of uniform, bones, the edge of a helmet half buried in mud. He stopped digging. He didn't want to see more. He stood slowly, staring at the horizon, feeling the weight of 1,000 forgotten graves pressing up from the earth. When he returned to the tank, he said nothing, but that night he couldn't close his eyes. Every time he blinked, he saw the ground moving, as if the dead were breathing just below the surface. Later, Peterson broke the silence again. "You ever wonder why we made it?" he asked softly, voice trembling in the dark. "All the times we should have died, all the shells that missed, all the fires that didn't touch us. Why us?" No one answered. The question wasn't meant for answering. It was a wound they all carried, one that never healed. Survival had stopped feeling like victory a long time ago. It felt like punishment, a sentence to keep watching the world burn, knowing you couldn't stop it. Harris looked around at his men, shadows in the dim light, faces drawn and hollow. They had stopped being soldiers. They were something else now, something beyond fear, beyond hope. The war had carved them down to their cores, and what was left was quiet endurance. The next morning, the engine wouldn't start. For the first time since Normandy, Clementine refused to move. Morris tried again and again, the starter whining weakly before dying. "She's done," Peterson said softly, almost reverently. Harris climbed out, looked at the tank, and felt a strange sadness rise in his chest. Not anger, not panic, just grief. They had known this day would come, but none of them had truly believed it. The machine that had carried them through hell was finally still. "We can't stay here," O'Donnell said quietly. Harris nodded. "We'll go on foot, just until we find a repair crew." But even as he said it, he knew they wouldn't. Clementine had been their home, their armor, their heartbeat. Leaving her behind felt like burying a friend. They gathered their packs in silence. Before stepping away, Harris placed his hand on the tank's scarred surface. "You did more than you had to," he whispered. The metal was cold now. No pulse, no warmth, just silence. They left her there, standing in the fog, like a monument to everything they'd survived. As they disappeared down the road, the morning light caught the dents and burn marks on her hull, and for a moment it looked like she was glowing, alive again, just for a second. They didn't look back. Some things are too heavy to see twice. If you've stayed with this story so far, if you felt the weight of what it means to survive when everything else breaks, then subscribe now, because the next part isn't about war anymore, it's about what comes after. Months later, long after the thunder of guns had faded, Harris found himself standing in a field that didn't smell of smoke. The war was over. That's what the papers said. Men were going home, trains were running again, and flags were flying over cities that had been rubble not long ago. But the quiet didn't sound right to him. It was too wide, too empty. He had spent so long listening to the heartbeat of engines, to the metallic breath of Clementine, that silence now felt like a betrayal. The others had gone their own ways after the surrender. Peterson back to Ohio, O'Donnell to Boston, Morris to somewhere he never mentioned. Harris had stayed behind a few months longer, helping with cleanup operations, pretending it was duty when it was really something else, an inability to let go. He visited the place where they'd left Clementine. The village had healed a little since then. The fields had grown green again, and children were playing near the road, their laughter soft and strange in his ears. The tank was still there, exactly where they'd abandoned her. Rust creeping along her flanks, grass curling around her tracks. Birds nested inside the turret now. The war had turned her from a weapon into a relic, and yet to Harris, she was still alive. He walked up slowly, his boots crunching over gravel, and laid a hand on the cold steel. The metal had changed color, gone from olive to a deep brown streaked with orange. He could see the cracks, the bullet marks, the long scars along the armor where fire had kissed her. He traced them with his fingertips like lines on an old face. "You did your part," he said quietly. "You kept us breathing when we shouldn't have been." For a moment, he thought he could still hear the faint ticking sound of her engine cooling, the one that used to lull him to sleep in the middle of war. But it was just the wind moving through the hollow barrel of her gun. He sat down beside her and took a cigarette from his pocket. The first drag burned his throat, sharp and real. He hadn't smoked in weeks. He stared out at the horizon, at the rolling hills that had once been filled with fire, and tried to remember what it felt like to be young. Before the war, before the smell of diesel and death became home. He thought of Peterson's question in the dark, "Why us?" and realized he still didn't have an answer. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe life didn't save you for a reason. Maybe it just didn't know what else to do with you. He looked at Clementine and smiled, small and tired. "Guess we both made it a little further than we were supposed to," he said. The wind shifted, and for an instant he could have sworn the turret groaned, like a sigh. He laughed softly. "Yeah," he whispered, "I miss you too." When he finally stood to leave, he didn't look back right away. He walked a few paces down the dirt road before turning. The morning light fell over the tank, and for a heartbeat, it looked like she was shining again. Not the way polished metal shines, but the way memory does. Soft, golden, alive. Harris raised his hand in a small salute. No one was there to see it. No bugle to play the moment. Just a man and the ghost of a machine that had carried him through hell and somehow back out again. He knew he'd never come back to this place. Some goodbyes have to stay final, or they don't mean anything. Years later, when he was an old man sitting on a porch in a quiet town that hadn't seen fire in decades, sometimes he'd hear a car backfire and feel his heart race. Sometimes he'd dream of engines and smoke, and he'd wake up sweating, the smell of gun oil in his nose. And every time, before he went back to sleep, he'd whisper the same words he'd spoken that day in the field. "You did your part." Not to himself, not to any god, but to her, to Clementine, to the broken tank that had somehow taught him that imperfection wasn't weakness. It was the reason they'd lived. The war had taken everything pure and replaced it with survival. But in that survival, something human had been born, a quiet truth that outlasted the noise. Harris didn't believe in destiny anymore, or luck, or miracle. He believed in endurance, in flawed engines that kept running, in men who kept walking even when their souls wanted to stop, in broken things that refused to die. And somewhere, in the rusting carcass of an old Sherman lying forgotten under the grass, that belief still hummed faintly, like the echo of an engine that refused to go silent. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, anything, then take a second to like this video and subscribe. Because the stories that matter aren't about war. They're about what's left standing after it ends.